So this is the second video that is looking at Section 7.5 monetary policy in Australia. But before we go on to this final diagram of Section 7.5, the next section is the next slide, so that'll be a separate video. Before we go on to this diagram, just a quick recap. What we've learned in Section 7.5 is what the cash rate is, or we were reminded ourselves of what that is. The cash rate is the interest rate in this very special overnight money market. But the importance of the cash rate is that when the cash rate changes, it flows through and affects other short-term interest rates, such as in this diagram, interest rates on 90-day bank bills. And this 90-day bank bill yield or interest rate is the interest rate that our banks, ANZ, Westpac, National Australia Bank, for example, pay to borrow money for 90 days. So when the Reserve Bank lowers the cash rate, it's going to lower interest rates that banks pay on their short-term borrowing, almost one for one. And so the banks then can pass those interest rate savings on to their customers in the form of lower mortgage interest rates. But the relationship between the cash rate and say mortgage interest rates, and I'm only using mortgage interest rates as a typical representative interest rate that households pay. Of course, many households have car loans, personal loans, small business loans. Some of you may have student loans, but mortgages are the biggest form of loan in Australia. So when I say mortgage loans, interest rates on mortgage loans, I'm really referring to all interest rates that households and businesses pay. Okay, all of those interest rates charged by the commercial banks. So when the cash rate changes, short-term debt interest rates change for one. That flows through and affects mortgage interest rates. But the relationship between the cash rate and mortgage interest rates is far more complex than what I've just described. Why? Why? Because the banks have multiple funding sources. And that's what makes the link between the cash rate and mortgage interest rates complex. And that's why very often banks struggle to pass on interest rate cuts one for one to their customers. Now, we've already sort of said that generally banks will pass on interest rate increases quite quickly. I can't recall too many instances of banks passing on less than the associated increase in the cash rate. So I can't remember too many situations where the cash rate has increased by 0.25 and the banks haven't passed all of that on. I think there might have been one or two instances of that over the last couple of decades, but it's very rare. So you could look at that and sort of frown at what the banks do there. But on the flip side, often they do hold back interest rate cuts. And hopefully we understand better why they do that, or at least their argument for doing that. Whether you believe that argument is valid or not, that's up to you. But at least we can now understand their logic, their reasoning. And understanding that logic or reasoning, even if you don't believe it, strengthens your ability to counter-argue the bank's point. So it's important to understand what their logic is, what their argument is, so that you can formulate a stronger argument against what banks do when they don't, or what they do and what they should be doing, what they should or shouldn't be doing when they don't pass on full interest rate cuts to Australian households. So, you know, very often people sort of just dismiss the bank's argument. And if this is the argument that I've put forward in this video and the last video, they just dismiss it and ignore it. Well, that's not really a good way to go about it. Listen to the argument, and if you don't appreciate that argument, if you don't believe it's valid, use it to create a stronger counter argument. Don't just dismiss and ignore and don't listen. You certainly don't want to listen. Sorry, you don't want to not listen, that's a double negative, to what they're saying. Don't just dismiss their argument. Listen to it, learn from it, understand it, and use it to strengthen your counter argument. I'm saying this because I've met so many people over the years who just don't want to hear this argument. They don't want to even listen to it. And that's quite that puts you in a weaker position if you want to then counter argue. So getting back to this, these different sources of funding, the three main ones, we've got 6 sources of funding there, but we've got 3 main ones. This is what complicates, that's the word I was looking for, complicates the relationship between changes in the cash rate and changes in mortgage interest rates. Because when the cash rate's falling, yes, interest rates on short-term debt will be decreasing 1-for-1. Interest rates on domestic deposits will be falling close-ish to 1-for-1. But interest rates on long-term debt, well, they could be doing anything. Historically, they have dropped at the same time the cash rate has been falling, but not 1-for-1. So then how do you pass on the full interest rate cut if you're a bank, if your funding costs are not falling 1-for-1 as well? Okay, so that's an argument. That is an argument against the banks that needs quite a bit of thought, and quite a strong argument needs to be developed to counter that sort of thing, because I have indicated before that the banks are responsible to their shareholders in terms of maximising their profit and maximising shareholder value and shareholder wealth. So creating an argument against the banks in terms of why they should be actually passing on full cash rate cuts every time, that's got to be a carefully constructed argument. Anyway, there's something for you to think about. Then we get on to the last bit. So what we did in that slide, and that slide was this component, this first component of this diagram. Now, this diagram is in one of the readings, one of the required readings from the Reserve Bank. But what we've done in those 3 slides there is figured out the relationship between the cash rate and interest rates for households and businesses. These interest rates are mortgage interest rates, small business interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. So those 3 slides gave us a better understanding of this first link. Now, what I want to do with the rest of this diagram is, because it is actually covered quite well in the Reserve Bank explainer that I've asked you to read, I just want to go through and treat it at a fairly high level and not give you the detail that is in the explainer. I would just be repeating the explainer. So what we've got here in this diagram is interest rates at the top flowing through and affecting economic activity, which is just real GDP, and it affects real GDP, or interest rates affect real GDP through the aggregate demand curve, changes in the position of the aggregate demand curve, and then interest rates affect inflation as well. So everything underneath here is all about how interest rates affect economic activity and inflation. So when interest rates go up, then we know the aggregate demand curve decreases or shifts to the left, so economic activity falls, real GDP falls, and we know that the inflation rate falls as well. So let's figure out what's going on down here in section 2 in all of these different green boxes. Interest rates for households and businesses, they flow through and affect consumption, investment, and net exports. Now, when you see this little sort of rectangle here with consumption, investment, and net exports in it, I want you to think this is aggregate demand. So this section here, which ends in consumption, investment, and NX, that is explaining to you how interest rates shift the aggregate demand curve. So when interest rates go up, consumption goes down, investment goes down, net exports go down. And that's the same as the AD curve shifting to the left. So with this title here, GDP, we could almost replace that with AD curve. And then what we've got down here, before we get to the components of aggregate demand changing, we have 4 channels. And those 4 channels are the ways in which interest rates affect consumption, investment, and net exports. So do some reading about those channels. They're quite important for just understanding what's going on in Australia and the world today, and also potentially quite important for the final exam as well. So I'll say this again, interest rates affect the AD curve. We know that. CI and NX in this rectangle, they are components of the aggregate demand curve. And these 4 channels explain to you the ways in which interest rate changes flow through and affect CI and NX. In other words, these 4 channels are the channels through which interest rate changes flow through and affect CI and NX, or in other words, the AD curve. So all of this element of the diagram is about how the AD curve actually shifts left and right when interest rates change. The next thing is that when the aggregate demand curve changes here, it flows through and affects domestic prices. Well, we know that because when interest rates go up, the AD curve shifts to the left and the domestic price level falls, or in a more dynamic setting, the inflation rate falls over here. So when I see the cash rate changing, interest rates changing, these 4 channels affecting aggregate demand and shifting the aggregate demand curve, which then affects the price level or the inflation rate in a more dynamic setting, I'm just thinking the AD curve moving left and right. And that's the full explanation of how the aggregate demand curve shifts left and right. But there are some additional ways in which interest rate changes can affect inflation. The first one is down here, where you've got the exchange rate channel and a line or an arrow flowing through to import prices. So what this means is that when the cash rate, say, increases, it increases, say, mortgage interest rates. Down here, as explained in the explainer, when interest rates in the economy go up, the exchange rate will appreciate. Now, what will appreciate the exchange rate is actually interest rates in debt markets, not mortgage interest rates. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But anyway, the exchange rate will tend to appreciate. As the exchange rate appreciates, import prices become cheaper. And in the Australian Bureau of Statistics basket of household goods that they use to calculate the Australian CPI or Consumer Price Index, in that basket of goods used to construct the CPI are imported goods. So when interest rates in Australia go up and the exchange rate goes up, it makes import prices fall. So for example, the price of imported oil will fall when the Australian dollar is high. And oil is used as an intermediate input. It's actually used to produce petrol as well. So petrol prices are included in the ABS CPI index. And so you can see how when interest rates go up and the exchange rate goes up, and for example, oil prices fall, that's directly going to flow through and affect inflation here. And we've got a little arrow moving from import prices, the arrows here, into inflation. So that's how, that's another way in which inflation can be reduced through higher interest rates. The third channel is through inflationary expectations. So coming down here, actually ignore this upward arrow. This indicates that inflationary expectations are somehow feeding back to interest rates for households and businesses. No, don't worry about that. So just ignore this upward arrow. What this element down the bottom means is when the cash rate increases, it will place downward pressure on inflationary expectations. What that means in everyday language is with interest rates going up, people will now expect the inflation rate in the future, maybe the coming 6 months, coming 12 months, to be lower. And with lower inflationary expectations, because interest rates are rising, people are going to moderate their wage demands. That is going to flow through, reduce the rate at which the costs of production of businesses are increasing, and that will then reduce the need for banks to, or let's just say, not banks, let's just say firms don't increase the prices of final goods and services as much because wages aren't increasing as much, and that just lowers the price level, lowers the inflation rate. And think about it in terms of you being a consultant. You might charge $200 an hour for your consultant services. And you thought the inflation rate was going to be 10%. So maybe you were thinking about upping your rate from $200, 10% increase to $220. But now the Reserve Bank has come along and they're tackling inflation by raising interest rates. And now you expect the inflation rate to fall to only 5%. What do you then do? You stop thinking about increasing your fees to 220. Now you start thinking of increasing them by 5% to only $210 an hour. That act in itself will lower the price level and decrease the inflation rate. Of course, assuming your consulting services are in the basket of goods that the Australian Bureau of Statistics use. But that's irrelevant. We're just talking conceptually here. So what we've got here is an increase in the cash rate shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. That reduces the level of economic activity. But what we've also learned from this is that when the cash rate goes up, even though the AD curve shifts to the left, there's actually three ways in which the inflation rate is reduced. The first way is that the inflation rate is reduced by a higher cash rate is through this leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. In everyday language, that means that there is just less money being spent in the economy. Less C, less I, less G, and/or less NX. Actually, I shouldn't have included G in there, should I? With higher interest rates, it's going to be less C, less I, and less NX. That's a leftward shift in the AD curve. But that means there's just less spending. With less spending, there isn't going to be such upward pressure on prices. There's going to be perhaps a little bit of excess supply or enough supply to go around. There won't be excessive levels of spending anymore with the cash rate rising, and that'll just take the pressure off inflation. So that's the first way inflation falls, just by spending in the economy falling overall. The second way inflation falls is the increase in the cash rate. The increase in the cash rate appreciates the Australian dollar, which then lowers import prices. That feeds through and lowers inflation as well. And the third way is the increase in the cash rate lowers inflationary expectations, which flows through directly through wage demands, for example, lower wage demands, and that affects the costs of production and affects the inflation rate as well. So if someone says to you, how does an increase in interest rates lower the inflation rate? In the past, you may have just said, because it reduces the amount of spending in the economy. And that'd be correct, but that's only this part, this sort of top part of monetary policy. Higher interest rates will also lower the inflation rate by lowering import prices and by lowering inflationary expectations as well. So that's really an overview of how monetary policy in Australia works. You know what the cash rate is, you know that the cash rate flows through and affects other short-term interest rates. Those short-term interest rates are just one funding source for banks lending. And we know now that the relationship between changes in the cash rate and changes in mortgage interest rates is a little bit more complex than perhaps you realized before you started this course. But then ultimately, when mortgage interest rates and other interest rates that businesses and households pay, when they change, it then triggers all of these these green elements of monetary policy. Part of this chart models or shows how economic activity changes through changes in aggregate demand, and other parts of this chart show how interest rates affect inflation more directly.